Hi, I'm Greg Scott, and today I want to talk about a new class of internet security vulnerability. Now, I know everyone's tired about hearing end of modern civilization warnings, but this is one we haven't dealt with before, and everybody's vulnerable. We're all freaking out about this thing in the computer industry, but it's barely a blip with the rest of the world, and it should be in the headlines. I'm not crying wolf here. Here's the agenda. First, we need to talk about the people who put time and effort into discovering and mitigating this thing. Let's give credit where credit is due because we owe a debt of gratitude. Then I'm going to tell you why this is important, and I got to give you some ingredients, and we'll put all that together into the exploits. And then comes the bad news. I'm going to tell you why there aren't any simple fixes. And then I'm going to tell you what the industry is doing about it and what we can do about it. Now let's give some credit where credit is due. I'm not going to read the whole slide here. What's important is this whole thing from discovery to mitigation and everything in between was a collaborative effort. People from academia and industry shared data and insights to diagnose and properly disclose this problem. A lot of people are busting their butts to deal with this mess. And that leads to the timing. The first group to discover the problem notified Intel on June 1st, 2017. Other groups also independently discovered the problem and reported it, and that set off a mad scramble inside Intel and the other chip vendors and eventually across the whole industry. It was supposed to go public on January 10, 2018, and the miracle is they almost made it that long, until the Register published a story on January 3rd, and that set off another mad scramble for everyone to get their patches out. I put a link on the slide to a nice article in Wired magazine about how all this came about and how the researchers pieced it together. Anyway, that mad scramble has some significance later on. Why would anybody care about an arcane computer chip architecture problem? Well, because it's in pretty much every modern computer chip on the planet, which means it's in pretty much every modern device that uses a computer chip. If you have a computer or a cell phone or a tablet, or you use a server in the cloud, or maybe you have a baby monitor or a thermostat or a door lock or a badge reader or a kitchen appliance, if you have anything that connects to the internet, you probably have the problem, which means this problem touches pretty much everyone. And by the end of this presentation, you'll see that it's nasty. We need some ingredients. This is a picture of a computer motherboard. Nothing special about it. This one has two CPU sockets where I can mount CPUs. See where I labeled it? Take a look at the memory sockets. If you have a microscope, you'd be able to see the paths etched on that motherboard between those sockets and the CPUs. On this one, there may be an inch or two away from the CPU sockets. A couple inches might not seem like a big deal, but in computer circuitry, it's kind of like traveling from California to New York. Every time the CPU wants something from main memory, it has to send a signal out across that motherboard and then wait for the data to come back. It's like hurry up and wait. We alleviate that by setting up little pieces of special memory right on the CPU chips called caches, and we keep copies of the memory addresses we tend to hit most often right there in the cache. The idea is when the CPU needs something from memory, most of the time it can grab it from cache and save a bunch of time. I'll give you more on that in just a minute. There's another chip on this motherboard called a BIOS chip. BIOS for Basic Input-Output Subsystem. When we power on a system, part of the power on sequence loads microcode from that BIOS chip into the CPU. Think of microcode as a layer of software between the real hardware and a programming language we've always called machine language or assembly language. In the old days, assembly language talked directly to the hardware, but not anymore. Today's microcode has some nifty tricks to optimize performance, and we'll talk about that in just a minute too. Sometimes we use the word firmware instead of microcode. Now those two words mean the same thing, but language is always fuzzy and definitions are evolving. There's a whole bunch of components inside a computer, and usually when we say firmware, we mean the stuff that makes all those components work. But when we say microcode, we really mean the firmware that's just on the CPU chips themselves. When system vendors send out updates, sometimes they package CPU microcode updates as one piece of a larger general firmware update. But sometimes CPU chip makers need to send out their own updates faster than system vendors can package a broader firmware update. The way they do that is they produce microcode update files for software vendors to include with their operating systems. Linux has the ability to load CPU microcode at boot time, and apparently so does Windows, starting with Windows 7. So the hardware powers on and loads up the CPU with microcode from the BIOS chip. Later on, when the operating system boots, the operating system might send a new version of microcode to the CPU as part of its boot cycle. This detail is going to get important later on. I need to emphasize this. It's a whole lot of trouble to make sure the cache and main memory are the same. So why do it? Powers of 10 will mess with your head, and so will billionths of a second. And what's different between a billionth of a second and a millionth of a second anyway? It's not like I have time to walk down the hall and grab some water. But inside a computer, a billionth of a second here and a billionth there, and pretty soon it adds up to a whole bunch of time. Here's a way to visualize this. Let's multiply everything by time units we can deal with in day-to-day life. Let's say, instead of 3 nanoseconds, let's say it takes about 1 minute for the CPU to grab something from cache. So then the round trip to those memory sockets is about a half hour. That's why caches are a big deal. Concurrency is huge inside computers. You're probably wondering why I put a picture of my washer and dryer in a computer presentation. Well, that's because laundry turns out to be as good an example as any for concurrency. Get a few things moving at the same time to save time on the overall job. If I can keep that washer and dryer running all the time, I optimize the time to do my laundry. And believe me, there's a whole lot of things I'd rather do than wash clothes. We see this with computers too. We think machine language instructions are atomic, that they're one unit and they don't split up. But at the microcode level, they're not. At the microcode level, systems need to fetch instructions and decode them and send them to the proper execution units and do a whole bunch of other setup to get them ready to go. If we have an instruction stream with instructions at various levels in that setup process, we have a whole bunch of concurrency and we can churn them out way more efficiently than doing them one at a time. Which is good because we're up against the laws of physics trying to make computers faster. When we measure data pass on a chip these days by how many atoms they need, we're pretty much at the limit for how small we can make them. So lots of today's performance wins come from optimizations instead of cramming in more circuits into the same space. And one huge optimization is prefetching and pipeline. It's exactly what we do when we go through the drive-up at McDonald's. I snapped this picture at a neighborhood McDonald's and the people in the cars probably thought I was nuts when I climbed up on a snowbank to get the best angle. Anyway, at the drive-up, you go to a menu where you give your order, and then you go to a window where you pay, and then you go to another window to pick up your food. While you're paying in one window, they're cooking up your food in the back, and hopefully it's all ready when you get to the pickup window. With computers, we prefetch instructions and we get them in the pipeline to start decoding and getting ready to execute, so they're ready to go when the execution engine's ready to service them. Speculative execution is a mouthful and it's an even bigger deal. So is branch prediction. The idea is, as long as we have these instructions in the pipeline anyway, may as well just execute them and keep the results somewhere temporarily for when the program's ready. Sometimes we need to push metaphors past the breaking point, and this might be one of those times. I'll try this out and let's see how it works. Every month, some friends and I go to the Loon Cafe in downtown Minneapolis for lunch. We've been doing this for a long time, and we always order the same stuff. My friends like chili, and I like rare burgers. I like to keep coming back because these guys know how to make rare burgers, and rare burgers are hard to find in restaurants. Anyway, we sit down, somebody takes our order, and then they go cook it up and they bring our food. That's how restaurants work, right? Well, what if, as soon as they saw our faces, what if they speculated on what we're going to order, and they started cooking it up right away, even before seating us? Theoretically, by the time we sat down, the food would be ready, and we'd eliminate all that wait time. Nice and efficient, right? Except, what if they guessed wrong? Well, then they have a rare burger and some chili back in the kitchen that they have to get rid of, and they take our order the traditional way. You don't see speculative execution in restaurants because it's wasteful, but we see it all the time in computers. The idea is the microcode speculates on which branches a program will take and execute all the instructions in the branch it thinks it will win ahead of time. When your program gets to that branch, if the microcode got it right, it's a huge performance win. If not, nothing lost. Just get rid of the speculation results and do the other branch. To put it all together, we need a principle called isolation. That means just what it says on the slide. Every process inside a computer needs to mind its own business and can only talk to the kernel or any other process by following well-defined interface guidelines. Otherwise, what would stop a rogue process from reaching into your address space and stealing your bank account number? The problem is, speculative execution doesn't follow any of those isolation rules. And for good reason. The microcode's just setting things up ahead of time to make your program run as fast as possible. If your program gets to that branch point and takes a different path than what the microcode predicted, the microcode is supposed to get rid of all those predicted results and put things back the way they were. It's kind of like uncooking that burger and chili at the Loon Cafe if we order something different, which doesn't make any sense in a restaurant but works nicely inside a computer chip. And the microcode does its job. It works. It puts everything back the way it was, except for the cache. Those transient results are sitting there in the cache, just waiting for anyone to steal them. That's the bug. A little bit of clever coding with no special privileges required breaks isolation and just might destroy modern civilization. All right, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but this is a big deal. It's been inside pretty much every computer chip since around 1995. It took the industry more than 20 years to figure this out. Here are the specific exploits we know about so far. You can see the CVE numbers on the slide. CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. MITRE Corporation assigns these IDs to known exploits and puts them into a database. When you're a security researcher and you discover a vulnerability and MITRE assigns it a CVE number, that's good for your career. Well, the researchers who uncovered this one also came up with their own branding. When you find a vulnerability and you brand it with a name and the name sticks, that's when you get on the A list. These guys picked Meltdown because it melts boundaries, and they picked Spectre because of speculative execution, and the spectacle will be around for a while. There's more at www.meltdownattack.com. Let's do Meltdown first because it's the easiest to visualize and deal with. Remember, Meltdown is variant 3. The idea is every process thinks it can touch every memory address inside the machine. Well, some of those addresses, like kernel addresses, are illegal, but operating systems defer to the hardware to enforce who can touch what. Well, I said hardware, but I should have said microcode. Remember, microcode is that software layer pretending to be hardware. Well, let's say I want to read an illegal address in the kernel. For whatever reason, the kernel has the keys to everything on this machine, and maybe I'm a rogue process and I want to steal a credit card number. So I try to touch that illegal address, the system generates an exception, and my program blows up. End of story, right? Except it's not. The microcode speculatively executed that illegal instruction ahead of time and then reverted everything when my program blew up. So far, so good. But it never reverted the cache. That secret's sitting there in the cache just waiting for anyone to exploit it. So I flush the cache, and now the cache and main memory agree. Bing, bang, boom, I just stole the keys to the kingdom. Well, that's bad, and that was why the mad scramble. That was the first wave of patches in January 2018. We mitigate against Meltdown by not trusting microcode anymore to enforce permissions. The kernel does it in software instead. So we separate the kernel and user page tables, and we take a context switch when we want to touch anything in the kernel. That mitigates the problem, but costs anywhere between 5 and 30% of our performance when we need anything in the kernel. Next up is Spectre variant 1, which is kind of like a buffer overflow attack. The idea here is, let's try to touch an array element outside the bounds of the array. Let's say I have a 10-element array, and I want to touch, say, element 12, which is illegal. But I've analyzed this system, and I know the secret to launching nuclear missiles to destroy the world sits 2 positions away from the top of that array. So I set my program up with some logic that checks an index, and it only touches the array element if the index value is in range. I run a few loops with the index at a legal value to train the branch predictor to take the branch speculatively. And now I run it one more time with the illegal index value. The branch predictor will speculatively execute the instruction, but this time it executes it against the illegal addresses, and it leaves the value in cache where I can grab it. This one's harder to exploit because I need some insider knowledge to know where those launch codes live relative to my array. And now Spectre variant 2, where we inject an illegal address into a branch target. This one's really devious, and as far as anyone knows, it hasn't been done in the real world. But then some attackers might not want to tell the world about it. Here's how this works. An indirect branch means look at the contents of an address and then branch to the content, not the address itself. Indirection always takes some getting used to. The best example might be the ret instruction, meaning return from a subroutine. Remember, when your program calls a subroutine, the microcode pushes the return address onto the stack and then branches to the subroutine. When you return with the ret instruction, the microcode pops the return address from the stack and then branches to where it's supposed to go. That's an indirect branch. Well, variant 2 poisons that indirect branch, so your program branches to my evil routine instead of the routine where it's supposed to go, and then I can encrypt all your files and demand a ransom in Bitcoin to unscramble your stuff. This is the toughest attack to pull off because I need deep insider knowledge of your computer to poison those indirect branches. How do we mitigate against this? A bunch of it has to be in microcode, and the chip companies need to do it. But the folks from Google came up with a software workaround they named return trampolines or retpolines. The idea is manipulate the stack by hand when returning from subroutines instead of executing the ret instruction directly. This comes with a cost because it's major kernel surgery, and it's major compiler surgery, and it's major software surgery because every program will need to be recompiled with a brand new compiler version to use it. Think about the testing cycle to update all that software after you've updated the compilers and gone through all that testing, after you've updated the kernel and gone through all that testing. That's why these mitigations are taking so long. This is the part making everyone crazy. There are no simple fixes. The truth of it is, every mitigation we've come up with so far has been a workaround, and they all come with ugly trade-offs that sacrifice performance for safety. But believe me, it's not like the industry sitting on its hands. Intel rushed out a microcode update in early January of 2018, but that update broke a whole bunch of critical systems around the world. If your online banking website acted flaky the first 3 weeks of January, this microcode update might have been part of the culprit. I know lots of kernel developers are working around the clock to put in updates because I've seen some of the emails. This is not Apple versus Microsoft or Linux versus Windows or VMware versus Hyper-V versus Red Hat. This is industry-wide, and we're all in this together. So what do we do about it? I was going to say patch early and often, but with the Intel microcode fiasco I talked about earlier, now I'm not so sure. So at least for now, the best I can offer is stay alert and stay vigilant. There are a few specifics we can do. First, if it connects to the internet, make sure it has a provision for updates. Stuff like baby monitors, door locks, badge readers, security cameras, thermostats, doodads to turn on your oven, all that IoT stuff. Every single one of those devices has a problem. When you go to buy one of these things, one of your very first questions should be, how do I update it, and how long will you provide updates? This next thing is a biggie. Most of the hair-on-fire emergencies we've been through the past few years have been a mad scramble to patch everything, and then it's fixed. Not so with this problem. This one's going to be with us for at least the next 10 years, or until new generations of hardware replace everything on the street today. That's the new reality we need to deal with, like it or not. And this is as good of a spot as any to address the one question everyone's asking. Why did it take more than 20 years for anyone to find this? I wish I had an answer, but I don't. I can tell you that hindsight is always 20/20, and maybe the researchers who published the papers were not the first to find it. Maybe they were just the first to disclose it. In one of the articles I read researching this presentation, I heard the NSA claims they didn't know about the problem and they never exploited it. Apparently, other spy agencies say the same thing. You make the call on whether you believe them or not. And that leads to that age-old saying, we don't know what we don't know. If this one sat there for more than 20 years before anyone uncovered it, how many others haven't we found yet? I'm not trying to make you paranoid here. I'm just trying to show you why good IT people are such freaks on setting up contingencies to contingencies. Every complex system has bugs, and computer chips are about the most complex systems on the planet. You don't want to be this guy, because sooner or later you're going to end up like this. And finally, here are a few links for more information. The researchers who uncovered these vulnerabilities set up a website with FAQs and academic papers describing the attacks in detail. That's the first link. The next two links are presentations from John Masters with Red Hat. He did one at Stanford University, and he did the next one at FOSDEM 2018, one of the conventions. John was a leader on the team that built the kernel mitigations. After the different teams reported the problem, John was one of the guys stuck cleaning up the mess. And then this last link is an article from Red Hat about the problem, and that article has links to a bunch of others for how different products deal with it. And then one final thing, thank you very much for putting up with my amateur narration.